Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for braving the elements as well. It's a particular pleasure for me and the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra to be welcoming one of the real giants in our field, creative polymath, if you will, producer, conductor, clarinetist, composer now, Michael Fine. I'll start with just a little bit about Michael, and you'll find that there are not enough superlatives to really completely depict his accomplishments, but particularly as a producer. He's a 7-time Grammy Award winner. He's won virtually every major award that you can win as a producer. He's the only American to ever be the artistic director. His official title, Vice President of Artists and Repertoire of the venerable and 100-year label Deutsche Grammophon. And he has relationships and has worked regularly with a veritable who's who of the classical music world, whether that's orchestras like the London Symphony or the Vienna Philharmonic, or great soloists like René Capuçon or Anna-Sophie Mutter, or big platinum-selling albums with people like Andrea Bocelli. And it's a particular pleasure, as I mentioned, to have someone of his star power joining us here in Little Rock. And why don't we kick it off with a little discussion of what does producer even mean? Because if you are watching a movie or the Oscars or listening to a rap video, producer can mean a lot of things. What is it for you in classical music?
It's a very well-kept secret, and we like it. We like it that way because we are very much behind the scenes. Many years ago, my son came home from school, and it was one of those days where they asked children, what do your parents do for work? And my son had no idea. He said, something with music. So I invited him to come to a recording session that I was doing, and I put some headphones on him, and at the end of the day, he said, I know what you do. They pay you a lot of money to listen to music all day. And I thought, that's a very good description, because instead of calling us producers, they should call us listeners. So we're the ideal audience. So I'm the audience in one person with a pair of headphones on, listening to the music very, very carefully, making comments that don't make us friends. Because normally, recording studios are very expensive. Orchestras are expensive. Conductors, well, we know about them. Very expensive. So there's not a lot of time to say, that was lovely. One of the most beautiful phrases I've ever heard. Instead, you're saying, you know, on the fourth beat, you're rushing. Fourth horn, very nice, but kind of flat. We need to go back and do this again. And so you don't make a lot of friends. But if I don't do that, because I do all of my own post-production and editing, I'm not going to have the material to make the perfect recording. And recordings are not concerts. They're created performances. And a good conductor like Phil, who knows the art of recording, knows it's a totally different experience, that every little detail counts. So in our editing work, sometimes we're manipulating phrases by 1 millisecond. Now you think, I can't hear 1 millisecond, but I guarantee you could. If I played you an edit and I moved it by 1 millisecond, it would feel different, it would sound different. So then at the end, we take all the material. So everyone goes home from the sessions, there's a glass of champagne, congratulations, a party, and I go home with a score with 2,000 Post-it notes, a pile of hard disks now, it used to be tape, and I have to put it all together. And usually we do multi-tracking, so we have 50 channels. Each channel has a possibility of thousands of parameters that can be set. And yeah, hopefully at the end of all of that work, we have something that you're going to enjoy to listen to, because that's ultimately what it's all about.
I wonder, for those of us here who haven't been around a recording session, if you could paint us a little bit of a picture of what it looks like. We had the wonderful opportunity to do a recording of Brahms at Abbey Road in London, of Beatles fame, with the London Symphony. Maybe you could describe a little bit about what the actual recording space looks like, and then your own space, particularly where you might be working with your partner in crime and great collaborator, your wife, Tammy.
Peter. Yeah, and my wife, Tammy, of course. Tammy's home in Rotterdam, and hi, Tammy. Recordings happen in many places, from living rooms to garages to places like Abbey Road. Now, the funny thing about Abbey Road is it is famous indeed because of the Beatles. It was actually built for the British composer Sir Edward Elgar, but it's got a terrible acoustic. We don't like to talk about that. Abbey Road, if you're listening, it's got let's call it a challenging acoustic. That's a better word, yeah? And I think as Phillip quickly discovered on the podium, that the podium is the worst seat in the house. He can't really hear what's going on. It's quite boomy. It's a large room, basically. And we hire it because we know it. It's bulletproof. There are no outside noises. They've got a lot of equipment. If something breaks, we can replace it. It's got a great cafeteria. These are the important things in music. Yeah, you should never forget that. Musicians, we need food to do our work and occasionally drink. So it's a large room. Early in the morning, the big London Symphony truck pulls up. They're loading in the timpanis, the drums. Our guys come. We set up all the equipment inside. And musicians start to filter in, hopefully filter in on time. The personnel manager comes and says, I've got bad news, Michael, today. Who's sick? Who's not coming? We go through the list of who's sick, who's not coming, who we can replace them with. We check all the equipment. We check all the microphones. Because even when you have the greatest artists, the greatest studio, something can still go wrong, and it usually does. I've made over 1,000 commercial recordings. I'm still nervous at each and every session. And then eventually the conductor comes, the stars, and we say, okay, get to work. we give them what my wife calls the fear of God speech. You've got 2 hours, you've got to get all this accomplished, and no backtalk, please. So.
Well, I think we can tell from the joy with which you speak about your professional experience why you record. But perhaps a bigger question is, why record at all?
Okay, that's a very important question. Most of the artists that I work with never listen to their recordings. Most of them don't like recording because it's not the same as performing. In a performance, you give your all, you receive the applause of the audience, and you go home, and maybe 3 days later, your best friend says it really wasn't very good, but you have a few days to bask. Recording is very detailed work. Sometimes we record note by note, bar by bar, bar by miserable bar. People get frustrated. The studios are generally badly heated or cooled. There's a lot of sweat. I was going to say that the studios don't smell good, but I thought maybe I shouldn't go there because you have a lot of people in a small space for a long time. The main reason to record is it makes you a better musician. The process forces you to listen. You may think, if any of you are musicians here and you record yourself, what you hear in that recording may be quite different from your perception of your performance. Just like when you speak, we all hate our voices when we hear them recorded. We hear everything through our mental perception of who we are, the music we make, and technically through the bone conduction. So as a clarinet player, I don't really hear what I sound like. I'm hearing it through the bones in my mouth and my jaw. So recording, there's a sort of mean guy like me who's there pushing a button to stop every few seconds if necessary and saying, that's not good, that's not right, try this, try that. Now, I have to say, it sounds very dictatorial and authoritarian. The real goal is to get into the artist's head and give them back what they hear. It's got nothing to do with my musical tastes or sensibilities. Don't worry, I have them, but I try not to let them get in the way because it is really about the artist. So I try to get a sense very quickly of what the artist wants, and I try to give that back to them. But sometimes that means stepping on their toes. But with a good, trusting relationship, I'm very proud that almost all of my artists don't even come back to listen. They don't want to waste the time; they'd rather work, and that's a. And when an artist comes to me and says, that sounds like me, then I've done my job correctly.
As an artist, the most conspicuous absent at a session would be the audience. Now, and the audience may be in our minds or even the ears in the booth or just the musicians participating in the performance. But there is a presence that is unique to this setting, and that is the clock. There are no clocks at performances. And I wonder what your relationship with time is as a producer. Is time a resource? Is it a parameter? Is it an adversary? How do you approach time?
That's a wonderful question. How we approach time in general. They always say that as we get older, time speeds up. I have to say, for me, it slows down. No idea what that means. But yeah, I have a great working relationship with the clock. Now, in the American environment, it's quite tough, and I'm a member of the American Federation of Musicians, so I'm not knocking the brothers here. But in the United States, with the symphony orchestra under the normal national recording contract, if you employ the orchestra for a 3-hour recording session, it's 2 hours, because they get 20 minutes break per hour. The 20 minutes you can start 20 minutes late, you can end 20 minutes early, but you've got to have 1 hour of break. 4 hours, no, it's 3 hours and 20 minutes, I made a mistake. A 4-hour session is a 3-hour session, that works. And you cannot go even a second over. And by the American Union rules, there are clock stations on the stage. Everyone has to see the clock. And the moment I say thank you is when the clock stops. And if that thank you is 1 second over, well, my record label has to pay a lot of money in union overtime. In America, overtime comes in half-hour packages with a 10-minute break, and quite expensive. And I was doing a recording once many, many years ago in Phoenix, Arizona, and the clock was running down, and I usually ask my wife at the 1 minute, almost like a warning in football, tell me when 1 minute comes. At 30 seconds, start counting down. And we always check our watch with the union representative at the beginning to make sure that we are exactly correct. Well, the last note hadn't finished playing when the second hand came around. And I said, thank you very much. When I had to edit that, I think I spent a week just trying to notch my voice out and have the musical phrase continue. And there's an old, the Metropolitan Opera, if you go past midnight, it's vastly expensive because there are 5 unions in the house. And in the 50s, there was an old German conductor named Fritz Stiedry, and the musicians knew they could slow him down to get past midnight, 1 second past midnight, and it was party time for everyone. And musicians can slow conductors down, and he can push, but isn't going to happen. So after a few months, they had to fire this poor man because they couldn't afford it. When James Levine came to the Met, he often did the opera Parsifal, which is quite long. And I remember Jim once holding the last chord like this, looking at his watch, and 1 second before midnight, he cut the orchestra off. And he was making a point, no question about it. But so in my work, my wife often jokes that I can tell her exactly at the first day of sessions at what exact second each recording session will end. But that's because I'm managing it.
Well, we have the pressure of the clock. You mentioned the things that might be surprise news from a personnel manager at the top of a recording session. Yeah. We've got the interesting personalities of musicians and conductors and everybody at play. Surely this must occasionally result in some stressful situations, some volatility. Have you ever been nervous as a producer to see how things were going to really come out? I bet you've seen some things.
Well, I'm actually 105 years old, but I look great for my age. But no, it's all the stress. Yeah, I've seen a lot of things. I mean, there are far too many stories, but I remember once we signed at Deutsche Grammophon a wonderful young German soprano. And we met for lunch in Paris, and she told me she was from Berlin. It was her lifelong dream to record for Deutsche Grammophon. And I said I was very happy to make that happen. And we scheduled her first recordings. The first was going to be with the Berlin Philharmonic and Claudio Abbado, the late, great maestro. And the second was going to be with now the late Pierre Boulez. And we were going to record in a church in Berlin, and I got there with the team, and the orchestra's waiting, and Abbado was there, and the soprano's not there. So I called her up and said, where's the limousine? I said, well, you live 2 blocks from the building. You could take a taxi. You could also walk, but we're all waiting. And I say this because when we had the lunch, she told us she didn't want to be a diva. She wanted to be just a normal, down-to-earth. And So I walked over to Abato and said, she's waiting for the limousine. He just started to laugh, and he told the musicians, and they started to laugh. And she came, and we made a nice recording. Yeah, I mean, there are moments like that. That was more funny than stressful in the end.
Well, you've just mentioned Deutsche Grammophon again, and that to me sounds like a dream job. Was it yours?
You know, many times I've taken jobs before asking people whether I should or not, and Deutsche Grammophon was certainly one of those. It's if you can imagine having in one small space almost all the top musicians in classical music, many of whom don't really like each other or pretend to like each other but have no respect for each other, where the staff were perhaps as demanding as the artists. I had one producer actually walk out on a session, and he told Maria João Pires that he didn't like the way she played Bach. No, that really wasn't his job. I've also had to go to babysit sessions with other producers because of the volatility of the artists. But I have to tell you how the job happened. I was working for an American independent record label, and I was getting a little bored, and I made a deal where I could work from home mainly. And my wife said, well, you do have to work, you realize that, don't you? So what would you like to do if you could do anything? And I said, well, I'd love to be the head of music at Deutsche Grammophon. It's the oldest record label in the world. Incredible history, great artists. My grandfather collected the recordings, and that was that. Now, I had an office in New York, which I never went to, and a phone that rang that I never answered. But I had to go in because I'd left something behind the other day. And the phone jingled. Okay. Hello. In a very posh voice, said they were calling from Universal Music in London, or it wasn't Universal, then it was another company, but would I be interested in being the head of music at Deutsche Grammophon? And I said, oh, my wife is incredible. She organized this whole thing. And I said, yeah, lovely. He said, could I come to Hamburg in the next few days? I said, anything you say. And he said he would come to New York, actually, to meet me tomorrow. I said, lovely. So I go home. What happened today at work? You don't know? But I thought I'd play along. So when I went to meet this guy, I was so relaxed and cool because I just thought it was a joke. They'd never hired an American. The culture was so old world. But I went to Hamburg, and when the guy gave me the ticket, I thought it was going to say happy birthday on the back or, something funny. But I went, and I still went with the idea there was some trick behind all of this. And they offered me the job on the spot and said, can you start next week? So I said, sure. And I did.
I'm going to ask just one more question, and then we can open it up from the audience questions. And that's that while we've talked about your role as a producer, that's not why you actually find yourself in Little Rock this week.
Right.
You're here for the world premiere of your Suite for Strings as a composer. And you have a unique perspective as a professional listener, as a performer, to come to composition later than most composers. And how does that influence how you undertake your role as a composer, knowing that you have this experience and you've been a producer?
It should help. I learned something, just to make a long story short. 3 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with a cancer called multiple myeloma. And I just needed something. She suggested I kind of get a hobby. But I'm not really good at many things. I'm kind of good at music, I guess. So, and I was on a train that broke down on a bridge in Dordrecht in the Netherlands. My cell phone was out of battery. I didn't have a book. I was in a bad mood. But I had some music paper in my backpack. And the train wasn't going anywhere, and it was on a bridge, so we couldn't get off. So I just began to write a piece for flute and strings. And I called it Skipping Stones because it made me think of when I was a kid and liked to skip stones across the water. And that piece was, I sent it to a friend of mine who sent it to somebody else, and the piece was premiered in California last summer. But what I learned is I make composing mistakes that I would catch immediately as a recording producer and probably slam the guy. You can't do that. You can't write that. It's a different part of the brain. And I've talked to a number of composers. So I only began composing 3 years ago. And the piece that the Arkansas Symphony and Phillip are playing is the first piece for orchestra that I ever wrote. On the other hand, because I'm something of a professional in recording, I don't like to write things that are going to give the musicians too much trouble. I try to be kind. On the other hand, a very famous violinist said, "Make it challenging, make it impossible for us. It gives us more incentive to play it." So now I'm adding a few technical difficulties for no really good musical reason in the new pieces I'm writing. But writing music happens because you have to do it. It's inside of you, and as I was telling Phillip when I recently was at a performance in Korea, and the musicians had questions, and I said, well, play it any way you like, change anything you want. But I realized I didn't mean that. I did have a very definite idea in my head about how this music should sound. But music in your head is very different than real musicians playing the music. And the real reason I wanted to come, of course, it's fun and it's exciting, but I wanted to hear the rehearsal to hear if what was in my head actually works, and I won't know till this afternoon, and then I can either kind of slink out and catch a flight back or stay. But this is the composer's workshop. Real musicians taking your music and making something of it. And the other good thing, and I said this to some people this week, good musicians save bad composers. Good musicians will take whatever nonsense we write and try to make it as beautiful and as musical as possible. So thank you for them.
As you listen to your piece being performed or rehearsed, do you foresee that you would make any adjustments based on what you hear or what the orchestra or musicians are telling you, or is it beyond that now?
Well, probably my lips will be, I'll be shaking and incapable of speech, but assuming I can utter a squeak out, I'm not planning on changing anything unless Phil says, if you don't change it, we're not playing the piece. It is crazy, but it's a theoretical, when you write music, music exists in two realms, in people's minds and imaginations, and when musicians actually play it. And I know what I'm hearing in my head. I mean, maybe it's not any good, but that's what I'm hearing. And it definitely, almost all composers have a voice. So you can, I mean, my wife says she can always tell one of my recordings, no matter who's playing. It just is a certain sound. And if you hear one note of Beethoven, even one note, you know it's Beethoven. All the umpas in Verdi operas before arias, you can tell what the aria is, you know. So my music has a voice, and it may be a kind of funny, silly, sometimes a me voice, but it's my voice, and if you're going to play my music, I'm afraid you're stuck with it. I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Would you care to name an orchestra that you edited least?
Say again? I'm sorry.
Is there an orchestra that you edited very little?
Well, that's an interesting question, too, because you'd like to think that if it was a great recording session, you don't need to do a lot of editing. It's actually the opposite. A bad recording session, you get by, what do they say, the skin of your teeth? Something like that, I can't remember the expression. You've done 3 takes, the last one is barely acceptable. Okay, you put it together, you try all the tricks to hide the bad things. With a really great performance where an artist can always do it a little better, you end up having more takes, more material, and it's more difficult to put them together because, oh, I love this note, and I love this note, and I want, the choice becomes extremely difficult with great artists. You have enough material to make 5 different recordings, and you have to make one, and this is where you beat yourself up when you have great artists. So, I mean, recording, I made the Vienna Philharmonic's first recording ever of Alban Berg's violin concerto, so there was a certain responsibility, get it right, but I had so much good material that I really, you know, and I've worked my life out that I can actually do a lot of editing at home now. So I can get up in the middle of the night and wander over to the part of my house devoted to this and make changes, and then in the morning not like them and do it again. So the better the artist, the more work, but it's good work. It's good editing. So
I'd like to ask a little follow-up on that. I mean, how do how do you come to resolution on the choices that you've made? Because when you have had a good session, it's almost as if the material becomes personified, where all of those different takes have different personalities, different reasons to love them, and ultimately you have to choose who you love more and put the others aside. And that's very difficult.
I mean, it is very difficult. And as you ask for the takes in the session, by the tone of voice that I use, I often get different results. Anger, we've got to get this now, produces a different kind of result than, that last take was so beautiful, but I think we can do it a little better kind of thing, and that gets a different result. And the other thing is that pitch changes. So that sometimes if you begin a recording at 9 in the morning, by the time 1 o'clock rolls around, it's sharper. That violinists tend to go sharp. And so you can't put those materials together without a lot of work. You can. But the choosing is the hard part, especially when you have good material. And, in the end, sometimes an artist will say, I thought we had a better take of that section. Then you make it louder and you play it for them again, and that usually works. There are a lot of tricks in our work. I hide bad things. I mean, not everything can be perfect, and there are ways to hide them. But yes, choosing is very much a sleep deprivation activity. And this is fanatic work. It takes me generally between 60 and 80 hours to edit a 60-minute recording, 3 or 4 days to mix. And those 60 hours are intense. And you talk about the experience of time. You start doing it and you realize you haven't slept, and you've sat there in your pajamas with headphones on, and you don't realize you haven't had a meal, because it's very intense. You're in the headphones, you're focused really on the score in front of you, now it's on a computer screen, the notes, and putting it all together. And then the other thing is you can do that and then say, this was terrible, and you start all over again. So.
You mentioned tricks of the trade. Do you adjust for pitch, auto-tune?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, one of the ways I can not have to do that, because let's say you're recording a symphony orchestra, the artists are not in isolation. So that, yes, I can change the pitch on the second clarinet microphone, but the first clarinet microphone is picking him up too. So I manipulate overtones with different reverberations. I'm not going to get too technical here, and I also don't want you copying these great ideas of mine, but they're, and also if a note is not pleasantly in tune, if I make it just a little bit softer, you don't notice it as much. Or I raise another instrument around it, you don't notice it as much. So those are all the things that we do to compensate for it, things that just, there's a very, very famous singer, I'm sure almost everyone knows his name, and his voice was a bit short on the top, vocally. And my colleague Hans Weber at Deutsche Grammophon said in this snotty German accent, "You'll sing it as high as you can and we will do the rest." He's no longer with us, so I'm not going to get in trouble for that one. The singer is, though. So, thank you.
I was an elementary music teacher for 20 years for the Little Rock School District.
Great.
Thank you. And I am seeing an alarming trend across this country, and that is the reduction of music and arts programs in our public schools. And it's very disturbing. What do you think we can do about that to remedy this situation?
Well, my wife started also as a school music teacher in poor towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and I've heard her stories about bringing Kodai instruments and really getting the kids excited. The fact that she was really hot and 20-something probably didn't hurt, but Tammy. It's interesting you say that, because I do a lot of work in Asia, in South Korea, Japan, and China. Everything you don't see happening here is actually happening there. There, the audience is growing. Someone in Korea told me classical music is cool in Korea. The audiences are packed with kids. If you're a classical musician and you want to feel like a rock star, perform in Asia. Cheering, screaming. I was once in the main hall in Seoul, the Seoul Arts Center, and I saw all these teenage kids with their camera phones, and I wondered who was in there. It was a conductor, surrounded by the adulation of teenage fans. I had a 12-year-old I'm guessing 12, come up to me in Korea and asked for an autograph 2 weeks ago. And I said, who do you think I am? He said, you made all those wonderful recordings with Maestro Chung and the Seoul Philharmonic. I said, you know that? Yes, I have them all. And I said, you should really ask the maestro to sign your CD. Oh, no, I want you. And I thought, that's amazing. Also, sometimes when I travel with my clarinet, if I tell them it's a saxophone, the TSA understands. I've never had to tell them what it was in Asia or in Europe. So what I see happening is I see a real diminishing of music training in America and a tremendous loss, the power of music. I think we all remember that first moment when we heard music of any kind and it touched us. And kids aren't getting that here anymore. In Asia, the top of society, so the former president of South Korea, Lee Myung-bak, we played the Beethoven Ninth for his inauguration. And at the end of the inauguration, the conductor handed his baton to the president in a gesture that was so powerful. On the front page of and the gesture said, it's up to you to protect the arts. I've seen this happen in most of the Asian countries that I work in. Here we're embarrassed. We think it's elitist. We think that, I remember even me, 1992, one of the years I was nominated for a Grammy as Classical Producer of the Year. So we're standing in line to get our tickets, the nominees. And everyone's, hi, what do you do? What do you do? And I was always so shy, Classical Producer of the Year, because there were all these big pop artists there. And then I discovered that they were thrilled about what I did, and they wanted to talk about music, and they wanted to talk about chord changes, and can you check my piece out? And I discovered that we were all doing the same thing. It's very difficult to build. It's extremely easy to destroy. All the work that's been done in this country by great music teachers like yourself and my wife, all that work can be destroyed in an instant. And when that goes, there are repercussions. All these kids that are graduating from conservatory, they can't get work because there's no audience for the orchestra. The simple enrichment that children get, one positive thing, maybe. They say that if you have a good experience as a child hearing music, years later, you're married, you have children, you've got some time on your hands, you'll come back. But they have to get that as children. And without that, I think we're lost. And how to make it better? It's leadership. It has to come from the top of society. It has to come from, as in Korea, a president. Another story, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, Gorbachev was at a performance of War and Peace at the Mariinsky Theater with Valery Gergiev conducting. And Gergiev, who I've worked with quite a lot, said to me, all these people were coming up whispering in Gorbachev's ear, "Sir, you have to leave. The Soviet Union is falling apart." Gorbachev stayed. And he told Gergiev after, he said, "I cannot disrespect the music." Now, is it a true story? I tend to think it is, because I know several of the people involved in the story. But this sense of respect for the arts. Let me give you some statistics also, and sorry if I waste a lot of time on this, but I think it's important. In Germany and Holland, I live in the Netherlands, there are studies. Should there be a symphony orchestra in our city paid for by the taxpayers? So the last polling was about 4 or 5 years ago. 75% of the city said absolutely. They then polled, they said, do you go to the symphony? The people that said no, they asked them the same question. Do you think it should be supported by the taxpayers? Same percentage said yes. The people believe it's important to have this. It's part of having a nice place to live, a civilized town. And I met the guy who was the head of all the theaters in Germany. He said they did the same polling in Germany, and they had the same results. People want it, need it. And it's a lie to say you can't have the symphony and a children's hospital. It's simply not true. It's simply not true. And there's good evidence. There's some books written in the Netherlands about this, unfortunately in Dutch. But I like to believe what we do isn't a frill. I like to think it's essential. And that's something, the difference between the American model, now my guess is because of the taxpayer deduction, America probably gives more money to the arts than the European countries. I mean, we don't see it that way in Europe because we say the government doesn't give any money, but they're giving it via the deduction. Lost revenue to the IRS, I guess. Not that I care so much about that, but in Europe it's taxpayer, almost 100%. The difference there is that the arts become the center of discussion. It's bipartisan support, no matter whether it's left of center, right of center, in power in the city, and it's there. You're paying for it. And I like to think that we can develop a mixed model of public support and private support. Neither Europe nor America has found the balance yet. But you don't want to lose this, and you have to fight for it. You want your children to have what you had, the experience. And believe me, it's worth fighting for.
I was interested in your experience as a child. What brought you into the musical world?
That's good because I always try to say something about Grandpa, and I didn't find the moment. But I was raised by my Russian grandfather, who was born in Nizhny Novgorod, later Gorky, and Grandpa was a watchmaker but a music lover, and we listened intensely together. And we didn't listen as background music. He had these two big red, extraordinarily ugly and uncomfortable chairs that we had to sit in front of these big old speakers. And we would listen, and we didn't talk. When it was over, we talked. And even though Grandpa was not educated as a musician, he was educated as a listener. And Grandpa and I talked through music for all of my young life, and that is the entirety of my training. I have no formal music education. It's thanks to Grandpa. Thank you, Grandpa.
In listening to you talk about some of the musicians that you have worked with, I got the impression that professional musicians may be a lot more temperamental than the average person on the street. Is that right or wrong?
Well, they're like everybody else. They're nice guys, not nice guys, crazy guys. I have I will say this: the greater the musician, the easier to work with. Without question, whether it was Leonard Bernstein, who I had a wonderful working relationship with, or Herbert von Karajan, or the better the musician, the more secure, and that security translates into a rather nice person to work with. But there was one very famous conductor in Rotterdam, where I live. The concert hall is attached by a bridge to the hotel, which is next door. So the conductor said he wanted a large white limousine to take him from the hotel to the concert hall. Now, so that would mean the limousine would come to the front and barely be able to negotiate a 90-degree turn for about, 15, 20 feet and be at the stage door. And I felt obliged to point this out to Maestro. Limousine. So limousine came, the guy could barely make the turn, and then Maestro told him to wait till the end of the concert to take him back at the end. Now, we could have walked across a bridge and never even gone outside and got his beautiful hair, messed up. But that was unusual, I have to say. Most of the people I work with are professionals. And I remember once I did a recording with the actress Meryl Streep, the narration to the Ravel Ma Mère and Poulenc's Babar, and this is a long time ago, so she said, Michael, do you have a cassette I could play for my daughter so I could let her know what Mommy did at work today? That's it. We're all guys coming to work. I mean, we're very lucky that our work happens to be in music, but we're also doing it for other people to hear. So in a sense, we have a boss, and the boss is the public.
Well, you just referenced cassette tapes, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the role of technology and how it's changed
Yeah.
your industry. No recording session is really complete without a rap party or something with maybe some scotch and cigars, when invariably somebody's going to wax nostalgic about the days of cutting tape, or maybe it's more like kvetching, but
Yeah.
we know that it's changed quite a bit. And as you answer that, would you mind also addressing this new popular culture movement of people that are asking for a return to vinyl and former methods of recording?
Technology is fallible. That's one important thing. I was at one of these dinners, parties after a recording session, and I was sitting next to a longtime colleague, Wolf-Dieter Karbatky, made all the great Karajan Bernstein recordings with me for other people for Deutsche Grammophon. And I saw his face, his phone rang, and I saw him look at somebody on his left, and then his sort of face dropped. And what I found out had happened was we had left the assistants to copy the material. In fact, they had erased it. He didn't want to tell me and disturb my party, which is very kind of him, by the way. Thank you, Wolf Dieter. And what he didn't tell any of us was that he made a private backup for himself. So it was covered. So technology is fallible, no matter what you have. I cut tape with a razor blade. It was easy in those days because the noise floor of analog was so high that it covered all the edits. I like digital. I don't like vinyl. Every time you play an LP, your needle stylus is wearing out the vinyl. So every time you play it, it's going to sound a little different. And to a lunatic like me, it's going to sound a lot different. Vinyl comes with distortion, automatic distortion. It's built in. At the beginning of digital, we made very ugly recordings. They were harsh, they were crude. Everyone said digital is terrible. We make very good digital recordings now. High definition recordings that I'm very happy with. And I did a parallel session with a film, doing a recording in both analog to tape and digital. And my conclusion was the digital was better, but that's just my taste. The record labels are happy to sell both.
We have a world premiere coming up on Thursday, and I want to make sure everybody is aware that the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra at 7 p.m. on Thursday at St. James United Methodist Church in West Little Rock. You'll have the opportunity to be amongst the first to hear Michael's new suite for strings as part of our Arkansas Symphony Orchestra Intimate Neighborhood Concert Series, Inc. series. Michael, it's been a true pleasure, enlightening and interesting as always. Thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you. It's been an honor to be here. Thank you for coming.
Good. I was gonna get on to you, Philip, if you didn't promote the 7 p.m. Thursday at St. James, because I think that's great. Michael, thank you for coming to Arkansas. Philip, always great to partner with you. We're proud of the symphony, the great work you're doing. Thank you all for coming. Have a great afternoon.